Aloha and welcome. Welcome to ThinkTech. This is your show, Global Connections, and I'm your host, Carlos Juarez. Delighted that you're joining us today. We're going to have a great conversation with a special guest who's coming back to the show, Ayesha Nibbe. I'll introduce her in just a moment, but first I just want to remind our listeners that as part of the ThinkTech series, this is Global Connections, a show that helps inform us about global issues. We bring the world here, but we also bring Hawaii to the world. Of course, these shows are streamed live on the internet every day, different shows coming on from 1 to 5, and this show on Thursdays from 2 o'clock. If you'd like to join us in our downtown studio, you can always do so. Send an email to j@thinktechhawaii.com. But let me turn to our special guest. We're joined today by Ayesha Nibbe, and we're going to talk about some fascinating things related to humanitarianism, humanitarian assistance, challenges in places in far remote areas of the world like Central Africa and many others, where of course there's a very large international community response, but as we'll unravel, these issues are complex and they often are not what we see in the headlines. We have to dig a little deeper, and that's part of what we'll be doing today. So first I want to thank you, Ayesha, for coming back and joining us. Ayesha Nibbe, you're an anthropologist here at Hawaii Pacific University, and I know some listeners perhaps had seen you before, but maybe give us another reminder of some of the work you've done. I know in your background you had a long experience. You did some field work in Uganda, in Africa. You also had a former Peace Corps experience in Suriname, in the Amazon of South America. Tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of your areas of interest and expertise, some of your experiences.
Okay, so primarily throughout my life, I would say I've sort of focused on issues of poverty. Mm-hmm. So in the course of digging into those issues, I have a background in economics and in agriculture, and later I decided that instead of looking at these things as technical problems, I started realizing that poverty really is a question about power, and sort of informal forms of power. So I decided to look at those questions through an anthropological sort of ethnographic lens, and so that's why I ended up with a PhD in anthropology. And as you mentioned, I've in the course of looking at these problems, I've been all over the world in the Amazon, and I grew up actually in Pakistan, and became familiar with the issues as a young kid, and then later on worked in India, looking at issues of displacement due to development infrastructure, in particular dams. And then finally I got involved in looking at humanitarian aid in the context of African conflict. So
yeah, and so clearly, I mean, at a fundamental level, these puzzles that always challenge us, why poverty, why wars, why conflicts, the world is a place where there's a lot of challenges out there. A lot of stories of success and innovative and creative solutions happening at the level, but quite often, at least for those of us in the sort of West, we often just see the headlights, or we often just see the crisis that's before us. And as I know our conversation will unravel, it really is complex, and you have to, as you've done yourself, not just do the sort of textbook and reading, but on the ground and seeing really what it's about. In your, at the moment you've got a book that's getting finalized and you're looking to get published on looking at some of the socio-political and symbolic effects of humanitarian aid, and we're going to talk a little bit about that because again, humanitarian aid is clearly a reflection of the international community, the West, kind of responding to some of these challenges in developing countries. And specifically this book you're looking at is focused on the African war zone in northern Uganda. So maybe by helping us frame some of that, tell us a little bit about that story. Here you have a crisis. It's been going on for some time, but as well, we all know that it flared up into the news in the last year or two. Suddenly this issue, what we call Kony 2012, just burst onto the scenes for sort of a very high-profile issue, but it's very complex. So maybe give us a quick snapshot. What is the crisis in Uganda? How has it played out? And you yourself spent several years living and working there, and so as you decided to embark on a study and understanding of humanitarian aid, maybe just tell us a little bit about that story. What took you there, and then what did you see once you were there?
Okay, so I'll try to put this as simply as possible, but in general, the conflict that originated in northern Uganda, which is now, we all have heard of Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army, it really originated, this particular conflict originated after President Museveni came to power through a military coup against Milton Obote, who was the president before that. Essentially, this was another iteration of military coups that were essentially sort of north-south. It was a north-south sort of conflict.
So in the case of Uganda, a country essentially divided between, different groups themselves of people, or how would you characterize the divide in the country itself?
Yeah, I mean, the divide is in a sense, I hesitate to say this in a way because it's going to lapse into a sort of a frame that people have in their heads already, but there are some ethnic divisions to a certain extent, but I wouldn't say that ethnicity itself is the sort of core reason behind the conflict. It becomes a lens through which, or a mode through which conflicts over resources and things like that get played out. Okay. So so essentially, I would say that a lot of the division is the southern part of Uganda is Bantu tribes. They have a completely different language group than the people in the north, where it's largely Nilotic tribes, and so in some ways that's part of the division, this linguistic issue. Another thing that causes division in the country is that the way that the political infrastructure and other forms of infrastructure were built, there wasn't anything that really unified the country in sort of systematic ways. So for example, at the time when I was there wasn't a TV station that was shared for the whole country. There wasn't a radio station that was shared for the whole country, right? Partly based on the linguistic differences. There is a complicated political system that's in place that is somewhat centralized, but then some of the what you'd say far-flung sort of areas, which northern Uganda used to be considered one of those areas, they weren't incorporated politically. They weren't tied in very well into that system, and so in a lot of ways people felt really disenfranchised and alienated by the political system in a lot of ways. So it comes across as an ethnic conflict, but I wouldn't necessarily want to use that term for it, but it kind of falls loosely under those sort of under that.
There are some aspects. And beyond that, you described, obviously, there were some transitions, military coups that, displaced people. A lot of it is power, who's got it, who controls the rents, the resources. But maybe give us then a snapshot, the individual who then gets into the news under this Kony 2012, Taylor, where does he fit into this?
Joseph Kony.
Joseph Kony, sorry. Yes.
So basically, Museveni came to power. And immediately after he came to power, there was a lot of cattle rustling, there was looting, there were killings and things like that happened in the north. And the beginning of people getting displaced out of their homes and being rounded up into camps. So as a result of this, people in the north felt that there was going to be some retribution for things that happened during the conflict when Museveni was the rebel, okay? And so people thought, oh, there's going to be retribution. So they sort of regrouped, and they came together and ended up sort of being led by this woman named Alice Lekoina, who was a barren woman who's illiterate but had sort of was possessed by this spirit called the Lekoina, and which was allegedly this Italian that had died in Murchison Falls, which is a nearby game resort. But people believed in her spirits because they really didn't have much in the way of arms or anything like that. All they had were sticks and stones, and they would cover themselves in shea butter and attack armed forces like that and win. And so because of that, people thought the spirit has power. And so people kind of rallied behind her. And she actually took this movement all the way down to Kampala and almost entered into Kampala with her troops. And then
Kampala,
was stopped.
the city
that's the capital, capital city, not the capital, but the main city in the south. And she essentially was successful enough that people sort of rallied behind her. Once she was stopped just short of Kampala, people said, okay, she's losing power in the spirits are losing power. And so then her father picked up the insurgency and carried it on for another year. And it's at that time, after that year, that Joseph Kony was said to become possessed with a spirit, that it was his job to take on this movement. And it was at that time that the movement came under his control, and that was roughly about 25 years ago. Alice Aquinas started her insurgency in 1986, and so there was a few years in there where there were other people, and then Joseph Kony came into control over what is later called the Lord's Resistance Army, and then that's sort of, it's changed in terms of its structure and its affiliations and things like that, but essentially that's when the Lord's Resistance Army started about 25 years ago.
So what I want to get to is maybe quickly the focus on, you've got a crisis that unfolds, a war, a country facing tremendous displacement of people internally, so you begin to have massive camps of refugees. Again, a story that, while it may vary, it plays out in a lot of other places, but when we think about humanitarian aid, I mean, here, part of what your book is looking at is how often the aid itself either has unintended consequences, or how often, there's a narrative that begins to form about, what is the conflict itself and who are the beneficiaries, or tell us maybe a little bit more about how, from the time you went there, began to study this issue, maybe there was some, some of the story unraveled, at least in terms of understanding the role of humanitarianism, humanitarian assistance.
Well, in order to tell that story, I should kind of say a little bit more about what happened with the LRA at that point.
Okay.
So essentially at the beginning part of the conflict, it was really directed towards Museveni's regime and toppling Museveni's regime. Over time, though, and they largely had volunteers, and I'm not saying that they didn't do any abductions or anything like that, but it was largely volunteers at that point. Or a significant number were volunteers. Over time, they started seeing that there wasn't going to be a big retribution on the part of the Museveni, administration. There was, but not to the extent that people thought. So it started losing, the LRA started losing some support. And so what happened, though, was there was a conflict going on in southern Sudan. And President Museveni...
Neighboring country, of course, yes.
Right, well, at the time it was Sudan. And they were, the southern Sudanese were waging a war against, a civil war against the Khartoum government. And so Museveni was actually supporting the rebels, which are now the Southern People's Liberation Movement, and so essentially the South Sudan their rebels were being supported by Museveni. In retaliation for that, the Khartoum government started arming and supporting the LRA.
And the Lord's Resistance Army,
which is on the other side. So it was a sort of tit for tat thing that happened. So that's when really things start escalating, and this is when you start seeing the violence sort of escalating and things like this, and you start seeing more and more people kind of moving into camps voluntarily in some cases, and then the government of Uganda at one point gets frustrated because they're not able to squelch the LRA militarily. So they employ this military tactic where they displaced 1.6 million people by force in the north and rounded them into camps. The purpose of this was, number one, to be able to easily identify the rebels. So if you were outside of the camps, you were assumed to be a rebel and you'd be dealt with accordingly. Okay? You were assumed to be an ally of some sort.
So in fact, these camps that began to explode, they're part of a government program to essentially control the population and try to identify maybe what they see as the rebel forces. But meanwhile, you have massive amounts of people in these,
1.6 million people. It was one of the numbers. It was one of the largest displacements of people in the world at that time. I think it was third or something like that, but it was one of the largest. And the other reason that they did this was to cut the LRA off from their supplies. One of the ways that they would maintain themselves in the bush was to go into people's gardens and steal, raid their food supplies. That was part of what they do when they do raids. And so they thought if we take people off the countryside and stop food production, then that's also going to stop them eventually. Over time that was a secondary sort of strategy that was in place with moving people off the countryside and into the camps. Well, they thought that they'd be able to get rid of the LRA within, or defeat them within about 6 months or so. But it took much longer than that. And so what happened was the camps were not set up to have people, 1.6 million people in those places. There wasn't
for that long of a time and everything. So,
but they didn't have food, they didn't have water, they didn't
yeah.
have schools, they didn't have sanitary, latrines and things like this. And so a Catholic priest petitioned the World Food Program to come in and start giving food aid. Okay, so this is when the humanitarian, when the humanitarian world starts entering into the conflict. And essentially what they ended up doing then was sort of becoming a complicit player in displacing 1.6 million people by force, right? This forcible displacement.
And by that, let me clarify, essentially the international community comes in effectively to kind of maybe, I don't know if you want to say support, but to at least assist in what is already now a government sort of plan to, put people into these various camps. So they're, I guess, are you saying that in such they're kind of supporting that or helping to make it happen?
Well, in essence, how can you have the camps without food, right? So in essence, they are playing a role of supporting the policy, not intentionally or
But by responding, they're effectively then giving the government almost a way to legitimize or to
or at least do it.
To do it,
right?
It
gives the sort of material means to run the camps. Right.
And we'll take a short break in a moment to come back to this. But obviously, what I'm curious as this international response comes in, I mean, again, and we see this whether we're talking now about the case in Uganda, which has its own story, but we see these crises happening in many parts of the world. Obviously, the outside world wants to respond. There's a lot of organizations that play this role, religious and other NGOs, and quite often you see a lot of unintended consequences from that. A little bit of what you touched on now, and I guess I'd like us, as we come back, to kind of unravel some of that, some of the power of what we might call narratives, and that in particular we see it today unfolding in many world crises. We have either the role of the media or the role of policymakers who are shaping opinions about it that can often really distort maybe what's happening on the ground. And so we'll take a short break right now and come back. I'm joined today by Ayesha Nibbe, an anthropologist who's done some field work in Uganda, a book that she's finishing now that's going to come out to describe the essentially the role of humanitarian aid. And as we'll see in a moment, it's a very complex one. So stay tuned and come back for more on the story.
I'm Hong Jiang, host for Asia in Review on Tuesdays.
And I'm David Day, host for Asian Review on Thursdays. Both of us broadcast our respective shows at 4 p.m.
And my topics tend to deal with questions related to environment, culture, history, and sometimes human rights.
And my shows tend to be on international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and national security. And you can watch our shows live on the ThinkTech website at thinktechhawaii.com.
And you can also watch us on YouTube or Olalo.
So come join us on Thursdays at 4 p.m. I'm David Day.
And on Tuesdays at 4 p.m., I'm Hong Jiang.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha, we're back and we're live and we're ThinkTech. I'm Carlos Juarez, host of your show today, Global Connections, and delighted to be joined by Ayesha Nibbe. Ayesha Nibbe is an anthropologist here at Hawaii Pacific University, and she's finishing a book manuscript on humanitarian aid in Uganda, northern Uganda, specifically a conflict that's played out there for many years. And again, we'll come to talk a little bit more about Kony 2012, which was just one way that it was brought into the sort of international headlights. But what I'd like us to continue, Ayesha, this story, of course, you've got a crisis unfolding, a huge displacement of people internally that are put into camps. You now have a response from the international community coming in. And more specifically, I mean, who is it that responds? Are they Europeans, Americans, church groups? I mean, a whole range of different organizations that become part of the response?
Right. So in the very beginning, now I'm talking about the sort of the entry of the World Food Program, which was fairly early in this.
And this is a UN agency that coordinates.
United Nations World Food Program, right? So at that point, there weren't that many players actually involved, and it was in a lot of ways later characterized famously as being the most forgotten conflict in the world because it was sort of ignored in a lot of ways by most of the international community. That said, like I said, there was some food aid support going on, and there were a few organizations on the ground at that point that were largely development organizations that had been there already. One of which is called, obviously, it stands it's in Italian. I can't tell you what that stands for, but they were there.
Move your hands like
yeah,
this.
So they were on the ground, and they ended up becoming a sort of a large presence at that point. But there weren't many organizations; there were very few. And they were actually trying to get a little bit more attention towards the conflict, in part because there was this phenomenon that started called night commuting, where tens of thousands of young people would come into town to sleep, okay? And they'd come and sleep in verandas and bus parks and things like this. You can imagine this mass of young people coming in. It was very dramatic. So, and they were trying to get attention for this, okay, this issue. And so what happened was in 2003, Jan Egeland, who's now the head of Norwegian Refugee Council.
Yes.
Yeah, he's a Norwegian.
He was probably a foreign minister, might have been a prime minister, perhaps.
He was not prime minister,
no,
but
okay.
he might have had some sort of role in the Norwegian government. But he was definitely, he became the Undersecretary for Humanitarian Aid.
With the United Nations.
With the United Nations.
Right, of course.
And so he came into office, and he decided that what he was going to have as his platform was that he was going to raise awareness for these forgotten conflicts. And northern Uganda he chose as his first
test case, a poster child to address this. Yeah.
Yes. And so he kind of went on record and started talking about this issue. At the very same time, there were 3 young Americans that came upon these night commuters. They were from San Diego, and they were 2 of them at least were film students, and they came with their camera. They wanted to tell a story, and they thought they were going to tell a story about the Darfur situation or the situation in Sudan. Instead, they fell upon the night commuters. It was almost a failed trip.
And just clarify again, these night commuters, they were basically young people who would come like from, I guess, I don't know, the countryside, and they would come into villages and towns and sleep at night.
Yes.
And then during the day, they would sort of disappear and go out into...
Right. So the discourse that was sort of, or the way that people explained this phenomenon was that it was children running away from Joseph Kony and the possible abduction from Joseph Kony.
And he's the leader of this Northern Resistance Army.
Yes.
One of the movements that's basically in the power struggle going on there. Yes.
Right.
Okay.
And that it was so terrifying that tens of thousands of kids would come in and walk and sleep by themselves in bus parks and that kind of thing. And so these young Americans, 3 Americans that showed up there and filmed this phenomenon, made a documentary, and they said, we've got to raise awareness about this. And they came home and they spread the word. And they were very effective in telling the story about these kids that were running away from this monster named Joseph Kony. Now, granted, I'm not an apologist for the LRA or Joseph Kony. They did abduct children to go into their ranks, and adults. They did engage in atrocities and killings and sort of terror activities and things like that. I hesitate to use the word terror because that's loaded, but it was. They were engaged in that.
Peaceful cream puffs. I mean, it was a tough environment, and they certainly did their share of this. But some of the criticism from you was maybe the story as it was being told.
But the way that the story was told didn't tell the other part of the story. The other part of the story being that the reason that the people were in the camps was because they were forced to go to the camps. They weren't running away necessarily. Some of them went there by choice, but most were forced to go there by the Ugandan military as part of this military strategy. That story was never told, number one. Number two, none of the story about the fact, most of the conflict actually, the Ugandan military was the biggest aggressor. It was hard to say whether it was the LRA or the Ugandan military that was more responsible for the violence and deaths and atrocities. It wasn't clear which was worse. Okay, and for a lot of people, up until not before long, when I got there in 2006. When I got there, most people were more angry at the Ugandan military than the LRA. And so for me, when I stepped into this situation, that was the first thing I kind of noticed was you know, in the media in the West, the way that this conflict was characterized was one where there was this monster, Joseph Kony, and then there were these kids getting abducted, and there was no talk about why they were doing this. Yeah? Or they were said to be, you know, it was a senseless conflict, and it was a bizarre, Joseph Kony was a bizarre character, that there was no rhyme or reason for this, that there was no political agenda whatsoever, and that they're just kind of abducting these children for no reason and kind of, you know, waging terror in the countryside for no reason. And no story at all about the fact that this is a political conflict.
So focused on just the humanitarian side, which again, there's some element of it, but not quite the political situation at hand, not providing, let's say, a real full story of the struggle, the actors, the interests, and so on.
But even telling that humanitarian story in a one-sided way, where it was, you know, people fleeing from Joseph Kony and not being forced to go there, because that's a whole different ball game in terms of who's responsible and things like that, right? So I had heard those kinds of stories walking into this conflict, that, you know, this was a, you know, that it was this crazy Joseph Kony thing, and that children were this, you know, the conflict was in a way born on the backs of children. And I get there, and I'm hearing very little about Joseph Kony to begin with. Some, but more complaints or anger towards the government of Uganda, number one. And number two, very little talk about children. And so this becomes sort of the question that drives a lot of my research is, why was that the narrative that was told, right? And what was the sort of purpose behind it, in a sense, or not intentional necessarily, but why was that the story that rose to the surface, not these other parts?
And of course that's one sort of puzzle, one question that you're asking. But beyond that, of course, what that also speaks to, what are some of the maybe unintended consequences or the implications of a narrative that somehow is maybe out of sync with maybe what you're seeing on the ground. In other words, the strategy of you know, focusing on the Kony figure, on the children displaced and all that, it reinforces a particular narrative about the conflict that has some political ramifications, both for how the outside world sees it, but also even the different players that are coming in. I mean, I wonder, let's speak again very briefly about some of the issue then becomes put onto the International Criminal Court, one of the relatively new institution of the UN, and specifically tell us about what happens there. This individual himself, Joseph Kony, is he the one identified, or who? What is it that brings it to the ICC, the International Criminal Court?
Okay, so so this is kind of an interesting story. Essentially, again, we're looking at a situation where the sort of discourse, the international sort of discourse about this conflict is that there's this guy who, for no rhyme or reason, is going around and abducting children and that kind of thing, okay? Committing war crimes and, you know, for kind of no reason at all. Okay, so, but the truth was that, you know, President Museveni essentially and the Ugandan military had committed just as many atrocities, and actually had the Ugandan military itself engaged in child soldiers fighting in the Congo and other places as well. Okay, so, you know, as far as the whole issue of using child soldiers in combat and things like that, both sides were doing that. So, so why then does Joseph Kony become, you know, indicted by the ICC and not other players like perhaps President Museveni or the head of the UPDF, the Ugandan military? Okay, what happened was essentially it was there was a group of Acholi, which is the people group of northern Uganda, who went to sort of petition the United Nations, and then later they were going to petition the ICC to indict both the LRA and the Ugandan military for atrocities that were waged in northern Uganda. They wanted them to both equally be responsible for crimes that had happened there. But this would put President Museveni, this would sort of implicate President Museveni, who at the time was, and less so nowadays, but for a long time has been, for a long time in his administration, has been sort of the darling of the Western aid community. In part because he instituted universal primary education. He very effectively dealt with the AIDS epidemic that in Uganda by, you know, quelling the sort of religious discourse about condoms. It's a very Catholic country in a lot of the country, and getting the church to promote condom use. Okay, and so they were able to sort of stem the tide of this AIDS epidemic. And so and you know, and after Idi Amin and the whole history of Uganda,
this looked like a to work with somehow.
Absolutely, this is a golden era for Uganda.
So would you be fair to say that there was actually some way of either pressure or resistance to having the Ugandan government implicated in any way?
Well, so I think that that's what a lot of people say, is that one of the things is the aid community wanted to have a success story in Africa. And so they didn't want, so there was a lot of sort of, you know, turning a blind eye to the North because it was just some sort of thing that was on slow burn in the North, yeah? Meanwhile, aid organizations could have successes in the South, right? And keep that going in some ways. So there was, in that respect, it was important to keep President Museveni in his place, you know, in power, and not have him implicated by the International Criminal Court. Another issue is that if you look at that region, that whole area is filled with countries that are not necessarily friendly towards the U.S., okay? You've got, you know, Sudan, you've got the Congo, and there's a small arms trade that runs through Somalia and through that whole region, northern Uganda, southern Sudan, into the Congo. And there are were Al-Qaeda operatives in that area. You may remember that Osama bin Laden actually was sponsored by the Khartoum government and actually had been living in Juba, South Sudan, for many years, actually at the same time, it said, as Joseph Kony. They overlapped in Juba. And so, you know, we have the presence of Al-Qaeda there. So, you know, this is at the time when the Bush administration is waging its war on terror. And so they also want to have Museveni as an ally. Okay, so this is another issue that they need to kind of keep him in power and keep the status quo there. He's a good person to deal with versus the other characters around there. And then they can kind of have a base there. Okay, so there's kind of several reasons why there was international interest in keeping Museveni in power. So essentially, there was actually, Joseph Kony was not the first person that was on the list of, you know, war criminals. He wasn't towards, you know, the top of the list at that point. They were actually interested in another war criminal named Bemba, who is from the Congo. But Museveni actually had links to Bemba. And so if they put a warrant out for his arrest, it would implicate, and then we've got this Acholi delegation going to the ICC with their thing, there's two cases that might implicate Museveni. Okay, so Museveni went up to meet with the head of the ICC and said, I'll cooperate with you and hand over Joseph Kony. And they thought, oh, okay, you know, the ICC had just started. They wanted to have a success. They thought this would be an open and shut case. So Luis Moreno Ocampo, who is the prosecuting, you know, head prosecutor for the ICC at the time, made a deal with President Museveni to
turn over or basically implicate this.
Exactly. They thought it would be an open and shut case where they could have an easy, quick win, and it would be over.
Not quite.
Not quite,
and,
right.
As we come back, we'll continue just to finish a little bit of this story. And again, talking here with Ayesha Nibbe about issues related to a conflict in northern Uganda, how it played out, and in particular, we'll come back to really understand both how narratives kind of can shape or change, you know, or in some cases even change really the agenda. And we'll try to see how we can finalize this chat, connecting it maybe to some other contemporary issues. But please join us for more of the conversation. We'll be back in just another short minute.
Hi, my name is Dr. Rafi. Every week, I'm right here at ThinkTech Hawaii, 3 p.m. on Mondays. My show is Boards' Bio Briefings. What do we do here? Well, we watch sperm swim, we see if they catch anybody, we check out the latest biosimilars, you know, the kind that, what was his name, the guy with the bicycle? I guess we forgot his name, but he was taking EPO. And other human growth factors. We'll be talking about human growth factors. You want to know where to get some? Maybe I'll tell. Anyway, you can catch me, as I said, every week right here, Monday, 3 p.m., ThinkTech Hawaii, Dr. Rafi. You can also find me on Twitter, Bioinfo Medical. Or you can catch me on Facebook, Dr. Rafael Boritzer. I'll be happy to converse with you. Aloha.
Aloha, welcome. We're back and we're live, and this is Global Connections, part of your ThinkTech series. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez. And just want to continue our conversation we're having here with Ayesha Nibbe. She spent several years living in northern Uganda, where conflict has unfolded for quite some time. But in particular, as some of our viewers will know, a couple years ago we had it play out in the international news in a dramatic way, the so-called Kony 2012 video. We're going to come to maybe unravel a little bit of what that's about. The issue is quite pertinent because as we speak today, we even have a continued engagement. The U.S. military a couple of months ago, back in March, has now sent some troops to help search for the missing Kony in Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo. All of these countries sort of intertwined in a pretty complex set of wars and conflicts. But we're speaking about several aspects, unraveling some of the story itself, but also even how the narrative itself gets evolves and changes, and depending on who's shaping it. We spoke a little bit earlier about this group of young Americans who had filmed a video that kind of brought some attention to the issue, perhaps not the full story. The other thing, if you could maybe speak to in a moment, would be this issue of the invisible children. This is so give us a quick update on what this refers to, and then how the issue plays out and gets into the headlines a couple years ago in a very dramatic way, where a video goes viral about the Kony 2012. So give us a little more on this story.
Okay, so essentially I mentioned those 3 young boys who went and, they were young men at the time in their early 20s, went and made this documentary, film about, and it was called Invisible Children, The Rough Cut, where they talk about this monster, Joseph Kony, who's going to abduct children and wage war for no reason at all and that kind of thing. Well, this ended up generating the largest social movement in the United States for any African cause, including Darfur.
So as we say, it went viral. It just went exploded.
Well, no. So no. This is really before
later.
that. But they actually took the movie on the road.
Oh, okay.
And so that Invisible Children Rough Cut became sort of the largest, social movement for young people, college-age young people at that time. And so, and essentially these young people put pressure on the government to take action in northern Uganda or in that region, on behalf, or to capture Joseph Kony. So in 2012, with that sort of large support that they had with young people who had then grown up and were now voters, they launched this Kony 2012 video where they, decided to make Joseph Kony famous, because that way everyone will know about it and put pressure on the government to act. Okay, and so a lot of people say that this was, not successful because they didn't capture Kony by the end of 2012. But actually, in a lot of ways, they were successful because the United States government, the military, did send 100 troops into the Congo to advise and provide equipment and other, things like that to the African Union troops who are hunting for Kony.
So meanwhile, this individual, Joseph Kony, he's sort of disappeared into, let's say he's being wanted. He's been tried and convicted by the ICC.
No, he hasn't. He's still in the bush, and
but in other words, they have not captured him. But the idea is that he's being looked for, and the U.S. is now even participating in helping to. The
U.S. is participating in it, and this whole thing, the fact that the ICC, first of all, that they indicted him for war crimes, and instead of pursuing peace talks in a serious way, and then this whole sort of movement of the U.S. government sort of starting to now participate in it is all done under this sort of assumption that Joseph Kony has no political agenda. This is the sort of driving narrative that is driving a lot of these policies, okay? And it doesn't implicate the other main players who, would be the Ugandan military, President Museveni, for example, or Bashir of Sudan, okay, who were actually, Joseph Kony, they're the puppeteers in a sense, and Kony's just a small player in this larger sort of network of conflict in that region, right? Instead, because we have interests in that region, okay, we don't point the finger in the right direction, I would say. in terms of where is the conflict sort of generated, or where does it really starting? Okay, so now we have a situation where President Museveni has been in power now for 26 years or whatever, 28 years now. Yeah.
2000,
and he's essentially become a dictator. Okay, and partly because we've been sort of propping up this regime in a lot of ways, and when you have a dictator, you start having a lot of, and you allow human rights violations like the displacement of 1.6 million people. Okay, and we're kind of complicit players in a way. Now we have things like the anti-homosexuality bill, where you now have a life sentence. It was supposed to be a death penalty, but it was lowered now to a life sentence if you're convicted of homosexual act or things like that. There was another rule that now, a bill that's just been passed, that's the miniskirt rule law. There's a ban on miniskirts.
In Uganda.
So there's all kinds of like weird sorts of things that are starting to manifest. But more than that, there's a lot of unrest in the country in general because of this dictatorship. And even if we capture Kony, it's not going to end the conflict in that region, because there will be very possibly another insurgency that would rise up to, because of the dissent in the country, about this issue. So,
and I think what this speaks to so clearly is, the era we live in, this sort of globalizing world, the power of either the media in different ways, mobilizing and influencing opinion, the power even of social movements. You described particularly how this Kony video that was produced a couple of years ago would have this tremendous sort of, widespread exposure, and then pressure coming to, to our government to do something about it. And yet the other side is just how the narrative that we've described in some ways doesn't always either have the full picture, or it might have consequences that go beyond, really maybe solving the problem or helping address it, but creating other issues.
I think the thing that's really interesting about this story, that's fascinating about it, is that Joseph Kony is now sort of looming in everyone's minds as this sort of legendary sort of mass murdering, sort of a Hitler-like kind of character, which he really isn't. He's a small player. The LRA now is about 200 people in the bush. It's tiny. It's almost non-existent. There are major issues going on. We've heard now about the military coup in CAR, in the Central African Republic. We've heard now about what's going on in South Sudan. There's a conflict between the Dinkas and the Nuer. There are big violence going on there. Many people dying, tens of thousands of people dying there. Hundreds of thousands of people being displaced. Congo, we've heard about, and things like that. Why so much attention put towards Joseph Kony? Yeah? Now, we've already explained that part of this deflects attention away from Museveni, who we need to be our ally. The other issue, though, is that this is a convenient way that the U.S. military can engage in that region. Okay? Ever since we've pulled out of the Middle East in our engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. military has focused increasingly on what is seen as a potential threat from China. Okay, so a lot of our troops have moved to the South Pacific. It's called the pivot towards the South Pacific, and they've sort of moved a lot of troops into Australia and things like that. The second front against China is in Africa. Okay, why? Because China, their economy is sort of driven by the raw goods and the resources located in Africa. While we were engaged in the Middle East and pouring all of our resources into that area, the Chinese were doing business deals and things and building infrastructure and building relationships in Africa. And so they're fully entrenched there. And we're behind the game, essentially. We're behind the curve. And we need those resources. 95% of the world's coltan is located in the Congo, okay? Which is a rare earth mineral that's needed for all electronics, okay? Technology is a huge driver of our economy, okay? So we need to have access to those resources. And so what a lot of people are saying is that essentially Invisible Children in this Joseph Kony narrative gives the US government an excuse to expand AFRICOM, US AFRICOM, which is the African military, the United States Military Command in Africa. Okay, and so, you know, essentially if you ask people in that region, is Joseph Kony a major threat? He's not. There's way, way bigger things going on there. Okay, so essentially this is an excuse in a sense for us to sort of engage in Africa militarily. Another, recently we've been seeing this bring our girls back in Nigeria. And I've been listening to this story and I thought, this is really interesting because it's got a lot of the sort of strains of the Joseph Kony story. This sort of irrational, you know, a group that has this kind of weird sort of religious kind of agenda of sorts and is going and abducting kids, right? Okay, and I'm digging into this story a little bit more, but I'm starting to see stories coming out from, or, you know, blog entries coming out of Nigeria now where people are essentially making the same argument that this is, you know, the reason now that why are we talking, I'm not saying that it's good that these girls have been abducted, but why are we focusing on this issue so much? Okay, and it's being alleged by people in Nigeria that this is another excuse to inject U.S. military intervention, or, you know, our troops into an area where it's incredibly resource rich. Nigeria is one of the OPEC nations. Okay, so and if you look all over Africa, this kind of thing is happening. We're having this increase in U.S. military intervention in Africa, and so in a lot of ways, you know, when you get down to the bottom of, you know, when you look at the story and you think, why are we talking about this guy who is, you know,
small player or not
completely a small player? How did he become the #1 war criminal? And why are we putting so much, you know, we even were going to send, you know, aircraft over there recently to capture 200, you know, a ragtag group of people that are basically on the fringes of all these other larger conflicts. Why are we focusing on these people, right? So you get a bigger sense of the interests that are being served through this narrative about Joseph Kony. Yeah.
Well, it is a fascinating story, and you know, as we kind of wind down our conversation about this, I mean, we've talked primarily about this crisis in Central Africa, Uganda, and your own experience from seeing that. But from that vantage point, as we look at other either hotspots or other topics in the news, you've just described Nigeria, which is clearly one that maybe has elements of that. The other one that comes to my mind is, of course, the unfolding crisis in Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, where you've got some, you know, pressures for separatist movements, and you've got, you know, a narrative in some ways that also portrays Vladimir Putin as, you know, sort of the cause of all this, and clearly he does have an interest in this region and the border of his own country, but you know, all too often it's a question of, you know, how does the media interpret it, or how does the story get kind of, you know, defined in a way that suddenly changes the dynamics itself. And you know, you've reflected already on a lot of these things, but I'm wondering what thoughts you might have on either the power of the media, different ways it can work, or, you know, what drives the interest, because you know, either, you know, if you're describing something, either the U.S. government is very calculated in kind of figuring out how to do that, or instead it's taking advantage of opportunities to present, you know, let's say an expanded role, because certainly from the vantage point of the U.S., I mean, there are, you know, put it in the framework of, let's say, the war on terror or the challenge of extremist groups, you know, there are elements of it there. But there's another part that might look at it more from, well, what are our interests? We see China expanding there, we need to counter that, and this may be just an opportunity.
Right.
But give me some thoughts as we conclude our discussion today. I mean, how do you see either the role of the media itself, the power of particularly social media, but just the general media itself, and social movements, all of these things?
Yeah, I mean, the media plays a really important role in construction of narratives. And you know, one of the things that I talk about in my work is how, you know, I was really surprised when I was in northern Uganda to see journalists, you know, especially in northern Uganda, it's thought to be a sort of, it was a good place to sort of make your name, right? You can kind of come in there and you know, tell the story and get a nice dossier going, and then you can, you know, you kind of can move on to other bigger conflicts and things like that. And we have a lot of really young journalists coming in who were kind of scared, a lot of times don't speak the language and things like that, and they end up talking to aid workers to get a sense of what's going on with the conflict, which sounds reasonable in some respects. I mean, they are working on the conflict, and theoretically they should know what's going on, and they do to a certain extent, but you know, aid workers only stay in these areas for 6 months to a year a lot of times, and they're told the story about the conflict from their predecessors. And so there's a story that kind of gets told and retold and things like this. And journalists tend to tell those stories. They don't, they don't have access a lot of times to talking to local informants or knowing who they're talking to and things like that, right? Having the context enough. And so, when I was there, and I talked to journalists quite a lot, and I'd mentioned to them that this was a forced displacement. It was almost like their jaw would drop and hit the floor because that was the first time they'd heard about it. A lot of them. And it wasn't until a lot later when, things started being published where some of the journalists, from academics, that some of the journalists kind of started catching wind of the larger context. But they play a really important role in this,
Some of it remind me, and we've spoken about this before, it sounds like that game where, you pass on, what is it, the telephone game with one person tells the next, and pretty soon, in the case of these journalists, they're getting sort of a second, third, fourth hand kind of description of something, and then what might serve their needs to report something becomes slightly distorted from maybe what it began as.
Right.
And doesn't have the full frame, the full picture.
Right. And then, if you add on the, popularity now of social media and Facebook and things like that, and the sort of the culture of liking things, a lot of people don't even read the stories. They'll just read the first line of the whatever's being posted. And that literally can become the extent of their knowledge about these issues. And so, in some ways, it's even kind of getting worse in some respects in terms of people having a larger sense of context and things like that. So, so I mean, and I think that social media can be powerful in terms of spreading word about issues. I think it's important that we spread word and that we have a platform to have communication and discourse and discussion about international events, but it's got to go beyond that. And that's part of the problem here is that, it's so easy to absorb this story about, because Africa is part of the discourse about Africa. It's a crazy, warmongering place full of, people who do unbelievable things like, abducting children and killing people and eating brains and I don't know, all these crazy kinds of stories that come out of it. And so it's easier for people to believe those stories and not sort of dig into the fact that people do essentially what they're fighting for is the same things we fight for. Their rights, political rights, their rights to basic needs and things like that.
No, and I think on this note, I think we're going to wind down our conversation. I think what it speaks to me, and we'll have to come back to have a further dialogue about this, but these images, these stereotypes, these sort of very almost fictionalized views that we have, they don't quite tell us the real story. And your ability to come and share based on your experience living there many years. I mean, I think Africa, for example, is a place where a whole nother story can be told about some very creative and dynamic things happening. Even the misperception that most people think people live out in the jungle. Most Africans today live in big urban centers, and they're dealing with the same challenges of any urbanized society. And moreover, we just paint this broad, sweeping, generalization when really there are very differences among even the countries, some doing better than others, and why, and many of them reflecting, of course, the legacy of the colonial rule, no doubt. In fact, the countries themselves do that. But main point is that we've got a lot of stories that need to come out and be told, and of course, our show here is designed to help do a little bit of that as we've tried to unravel some of the either myths or misperceptions. I hope you can come back to join us again to give some other stories of places, whether it's Africa or elsewhere, Asia, Latin America, where there's a lot going on that we need to kind of appreciate and understand. And ultimately, people need to get out of their comfort zones, see the world themselves, and that is not easy, and not everybody can do that, but otherwise we can lurk and turn to people like yourself who've had that opportunity. We can also learn from others who've come from there, whether they've been aid workers, whether they're African immigrants themselves. So I want to just thank you for sharing some of your personal experience, some insights from this. We've been talking today with Ayesha Nibbe, an anthropologist who has helped us understand a little bit more about this very complex story in Uganda, of course. And Uganda really only part of a larger region of Central Africa because there's so much interlinked and overlapping things. but understanding both the power of the media, but also the ways in which sometimes that media story can be quite distorted or not the full picture. And we need to always dig a little deeper. That's what we do. So thank you for joining us today on Global Connections. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez. Stay tuned for our next segment, and we'll come back with Ayesha on another occasion. Thank you so much. Aloha.